Flip a coin?
Go ahead, Robert.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Grillo, and I'm the founder and director of Free From Harm, as well as the founder of a campaign of ours that is taking up most of my time now, which is called Slaughter Free Chicago, which has become Slaughter Free Cities, a campaign to introduce chapters of slaughter-free cities in other cities. Like we have one in Milwaukee, and we're starting one in Toronto, and we have one in New York City, and we're talking to people in LA, so it's kind of starting to spread. So I'd like to just, a word about, first of all, a word about activism in general and the kind of style of activism that I'm attracted to. So I believe that transformational change is possible and achievable, but it requires transformational activism. And so what I mean by that is, for example, what books like This Is an Uprising by Mark and Paul Engler, which is such an important recent book about how change happens and how we can learn from other movements that used nonviolent action to really bring about rapid change. We can also look at the work of Martin Luther King Jr. And Cesar Chavez and Gandhi for inspiration and wisdom. So for me, activism is not a mere transaction to be left to the negotiations of lobbyists and lawyers, even though we work with lobbyists and lawyers, we love them, but it's that in itself is not enough. Meaningful change requires that everyday people engage in bold and creative, nonviolent action that disrupts business as usual, but also builds public support over time. So as for the subject of this conference, or I guess it's a conference, right? You can call it a conference.
That's a good preposition.
I consider it a conference, but so I guess I want to pose the question, is factory farming really the right way to frame the problem? For me, factory farming, that slogan, implies that there's a viable alternative to eating animals in an age when our population is 7 billion plus and growing rapidly. I'd like to take a few minutes to reflect a little more deeply on this phrase, factory farming, if you'll entertain some thought experiments from me. Is that okay? Good, because otherwise that would pretty much can the rest of my presentation, or speech here. So, okay, so if I were to describe an egg hatchery that could hatch thousands of chicks a day, would most of us call this a factory farm? Okay. And yet, we'd have to go all the way back in history, 3,000 years, to ancient Egypt for this example. If I were to describe a method of breeding that involved weeding out and mercilessly killing off thousands upon thousands of weak, deformed, injured, and diseased animals, and only breeding the strongest individuals, or those that have certain traits that farmers desire for greatest productivity, would we call this practice factory farming?
Yes.
And yet this practice has been going on for hundreds of years, long before modern farming. If I were to describe chickens who can lay their entire body weight in eggs every 24 to 30 days in their egg-laying prime, or dairy cows that are engineered to produce far more milk than is necessary to feed one calf, a single calf, would we call this practice factory farming? If I were to describe the mass disruption of ecosystems through the mass slaughter of wildlife, at times to the point of extinction of certain species, who present either a nuisance or a threat to raising domestic animals. Domestic animals who are essentially invasive species that actually displace native species habitat. Wouldn't we consider this an example of factory farming? And yet, this is a practice that goes back thousands of years. If I were to describe, without getting into any detail, the gruesome mutilations to newborn animals that cause intense physical and psychological pain and scarring, to render these animals more subservient and submissive to us, most of us would associate this with factory farming, right? If I were to describe an adorable baby goat hopping around the field with joy with some of his friends, whose lives would be soon drastically cut short, because their owners regard them as their bodies as nothing more than currency to trade products and services. Isn't this the mindset of factory farming? And yet, this is as old as herding culture. So, in my book, Farm to Fable, that Brianna mentioned, I argue that domestication and commodification of other species, a practice which is older than written language and civilization itself, formed the ideological basis of what we now call factory farming. The Industrial Revolution brought the economic system in which factory farming could spread like a cancer. In Farm to Fable, I write, what we call domestication is nothing short of wholesale capture, confinement, breeding, and commodification of once wild and free animals, which began some 10,000 years ago. In his book, An Unnatural Order, Jim Mason explains that the, quote, control and manipulation of animals, their numbers, sizes, and shapes, became almost an obsession in herding cultures. In time, control became valued in and of itself. It was the way of the Good Shepherd, a patriarchal model for the guilt-free exploitation of animals and natural processes, end quote. In another part of my book, I argue that all commercial farming is factory farming when we consider the very ancient model of exploiting animals as mere resources, with total control over their reproduction, the stealing and trafficking of their offspring, standard bodily mutilations, destruction of their families and social order, biological manipulation of their bodies, selective breeding, and ultimately the systematic violence of taking their infant and adolescent lives. All of the above are necessary in any kind of farming today to render their flesh and secretions into products of consumption. So, I see factory farming as a result, not the source of the most serious ethical and environmental crises that we face today. In other words, factory farming is the symptom, but not the disease. The disease is the belief in human supremacy that translates into doing whatever we want with whoever we want. A transformational approach to activism would therefore require that we root out the disease, while at the same time push for solutions that can be easily implemented now. And one of those could be a demand that the public and private sector leaders promote and implement a plant-based food system to avert a climate emergency. In a final thought on the slogan factory farming, I'd like to leave you with the words of former pig farmer Bob Comas. I love the honesty of these words, and every time I read them, I feel like I'm reading it for the first time. He says, livestock farmers, no matter what kind, from the largest, most cynical and inhumane factory farmers to the smallest, seemingly most ethical, pasture-based farmers, traffic in death. It is death that is our aim and our purpose. Death is the end, life is the means, money the reward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.